could have contributed to this happening?
Excuse me. The other thing that we noted with this particular analyst was that they were cutting their samples with a scalpel blade that was not attached to a handle. So that's just, that's got their fingertips much closer to the evidence. So we asked that they start using a blade. Yeah, go ahead.
We routinely, we have a staff database where we can routinely check for contamination as well.
Well, DNA contamination.
Right.
An elimination database, is that what you mean? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So, sorry, so the second part of my question is, since there were these sort of, do no other analysts just go use the scalpel? Does everyone else use the handle on the scalpel? And if analysts are walking through the lab area without masks, wouldn't that affect more than just that one analyst? I'm just curious why you didn't, check work of other analysts, given the root cause or the contributing factors you found.
We don't necessarily believe someone just walking through the lab would contaminate that sample. We do require a second analyst to sign off on someone's RSID saliva results. So that means there's two people around the evidence. And if someone is signing off on the results didn't necessarily always have a mask on, and now they will be.
But do you understand what I'm getting at? If they're lab-wide practices that are, have you checked the practices of all the other analysts? Is no one else not using a handle on their scalpel?
Jessica, if I could, there were other people who took the same proficiency test, and there was only one analyst who had this. So that just goes to show that it serves as a checks and balances for other analysts taking the test who got the expected result in the saliva for the RSID. So,
yeah, no, I understand.
So
it's like a control, but it's if there are these lab-wide, it also could just be luck that there was no contamination and other analysts are engaged in the same practices. Maybe they didn't contaminate that sample, but they could have contaminated something else. It's just only because I think it was a thorough investigation, except it stopped at that individual analyst, even though you did do a thorough job looking at other causes. But if these other causes extend beyond that single analyst, wouldn't it make sense just to check more work, just to ensure that it wasn't affecting, other casework?
Sure. I understand where you're coming from. And I do believe the other analysts are using handles on their scalpel blades.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. Any other questions for this Erie?
Sorry, just a quick one on the fire debris. Is that to you also? Okay.
Same here.
I just want to make sure I understand it. There was a misidentification of petroleum distillate. And was that, I just want to make sure I understand the cause. Was it because the laboratory didn't have the correct reference standard? Was that the cause?
Maria, do you want me to take this one?
That would be great.
No, that is not why. So when you're reporting fire ignitable liquid results, you're reporting to a classification, and the lab does have reference materials of each class. Within each class, you are going to see variation amongst specific ignitable liquids. For example, heavy petroleum is a range. That might be various types of kerosene or diesel fuels, right? And they all have their own unique characteristics, but you are evaluating the class. So we do have examples of each class. However, in this particular proficiency, there were components that led two of the analysts to believe it was a miscellaneous because, like I said, we have references for each class. We had references of the miscellaneous category that were extremely similar to the reference materials, and they felt the data was more closely represented by the miscellaneous references we had than the heavies that we had in-house. So we believe that purchasing more heavies of different varieties would help us see a greater range. But the references they used from the miscellaneous category were spot on.
spot on or close, but not, sorry, I thought I heard you say they were,
I would call them spot on, to be
Yeah,
honest. The
yeah.
characteristics were very, very close.
yeah.
When you're doing a comparison, when you're doing an ignitable liquid comparison, they had all of the components necessary to call it a miscellaneous.
But was that a different class than what the, PT was saying was the correct
Correct.
answer of petroleum distillate?
Correct.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
So we'll move on to Erie County Medical Examiner's Office of Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. The laboratory has notified A&AB and the Commission of report discrepancies found following an update of their laboratory information management system. These discrepancies were found in the footer of 14 postmortem cases and in the date received in the lab of 12 legal cases. All affected cases had amended reports generated, and the laboratory considers the issue to be closed. We do have representatives from the laboratory available for questions.
Is this off of the trigger pull one, or are we not? I don't know
Nope,
if we're there.
Not yet.
Next one.
That's coming.
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. Hearing no questions regarding this, the LIMS system at Erie, we'll move to Monroe County then. Monroe County Crime Laboratory has a couple of issues here. We have the first being a notification to NAB and the Commission of an unexpected result on a firearms gunshot residue PT. They filed an appeal with the provider based on the drop-down menu choices, and the provider concluded the lab had included their conclusions in the report. If the lab had included their conclusions in the report wording or comment section on the online answer sheet, the response would have been marked as correct. However, since the concern was not expressed prior to the proficiency test report being received, the grading of the test was appropriate. Also, the second item, a closeout of an issue regarding trigger pull measurement uncertainty, first discussed at the March meeting earlier this year. It was found that an incorrect value was used when calculating the trigger measurement uncertainty. A secondary review of the data has not been performed due to limited training and time frame. The lab has revised their procedures, identified affected cases, and issued amended reports, and provided additional training to staff. We do have laboratory representatives available. Lindsay will find them. And I see a couple questions, so a couple hands. Down by your feet. Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah. Maybe had coffee.
I'm never cold. I'm never
You
cold.
can make it happen.
I'll bring blankets next time.
All right, I see the lab is with us. Aaron, did you want to go first? I saw your hand kind of.
Yeah.
I'll let others go first because
Yeah.
I wasn't
Okay.
here in March, so I feel like I could learn from other questions.
Okay, is anybody here?
I have some questions.
Sure.
So how, if I'm reading this right, there was not a review of the calculation because there wasn't any trained personnel or other trained personnel? Is that correct on the trigger pull?
When I developed the trigger pull, I was the only trained person in the building to develop the trigger pull. So I went through it and created the number that we had, but there wasn't another person here to review my work at that time.
Right, but couldn't the calculation itself, the equation that's used or the standard curve that's used actually just be administratively reviewed by someone? Just to make sure that it was, because this was a transcription error, it looks like, correct? It was taken from one form and put onto another form?
Correct. That's exactly what happened. And in hindsight, that would have been an excellent path for us to do. But at the time I reviewed it, I thought it was correct in what I was using. And we fixed the policy since then, so that can't happen again.
Okay. I just want to note from, I saw a discrepancy, it probably not a big deal. It said that there was 73 cases affected in one place and 75 in another.
Yes, that was a typo on our part. It's 73 cases were affected.
Got it. Got it. The other thing I just have to say for the type A personality in me. The protocols that you have, you provided, there's no bullets or numbers associated with the steps, and just as a good practice, right? If you have numbers there, at least you would be able to know where you are if you were following them. So that's, I guess, the academic in me too. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Can I, are you done?
Yeah, I'm done.
Erin, did you want to go or?
Go ahead.
I just had a follow-up on the nature of, or the cause of the error, and I apologize if I missed it, but I heard you say that it was cut and paste. Just reading through the materials, I mean, that's good to hear, but it was just, if it was just accidental oversight. But reading the materials, there could have been other explanations that, you know, we all use templates, and then you go in and you change the individual values as appropriate. So was it just that the analysts forgot to change the measurement uncertainty? I'm just concerned it's not a situation where they didn't know how to calculate it, or they didn't even understand it fundamentally and thought we can just use this other value. So it's fine, right? Like, I just want to be able to distinguish between those two circumstances, because they're different, and they would have different, you know, implications and causes.
I understand. It was just an oversight on me not changing the number. I understand how.
Oh, it's you. Okay, I see. Uh-huh.
I had used that formula for barrel and overall length, so I just cut and paste that, and I just failed to change that one value when I was creating the trigger pull.
But you're the individual in the lab that does do the calculations for measurement uncertainty, so you do know how to do that. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Jessica's question was my question, so I'm good.
Any further questions for this laboratory?
They also have class 1 and class 2 marked, but they're calling it a class 2, like characteristic.
That was,
Do both of them need to be marked?
class 2.
It was just a typo. That was a class 2 as well.
I figured, because you have it down in the summary after in section 5. Yeah, section 5.
I have a question. I'm not sure if it's better directed at the lab or sort of the universe of accreditation, but I did see that the lab said that this was a certain category that would not require reporting normally to ANAB, but the lab did report it to ANAB. Please correct me if I'm wrong, which I think was the right call, but who decides this? I mean, this involved the incorrect measurement uncertainty value and amendment of 70+ reports. I guess my question is, why on earth wouldn't that be reportable to ANAB? And I'm glad the lab did, but how is that possible that wouldn't, is that a lab specific determination or an ANAB determination?
Lab management system.
Within
There
our
are
lab,
some guardrails that are in like language of ANAB,
Yeah.
but it's up to the management system to determine specifics.
Do we as a commission have sort of, like, is that a part of a protocol? Like, I suppose it would be, right? Like, we treat these as reportable on this level. I know labs do sort of divide up into seriousness, risk of reoccurrence, and there's a whole matrix now. So that's part of lab protocols, correct? What would be reported to ANAB generally? Okay.
Would defer
I
to
guess
three
it
lab
is for labs,
directors,
yeah.
but.
Yeah, it's part of our protocol.
Okay.
the Albany
Thank you.
Press.
Jessica,
Yeah.
just as an aside, or to follow on, sometimes we start off in one place, and then as we do our root cause, it may take us back or, less stringent, more stringent. We may start off, it doesn't need to be reported, then we'll, as we're doing a deeper dive, we say, oh, this really does need to be reported. So it's fluid, but we do take a stepwise process. And sometimes we think it starts here and then it ends up someplace different. And then it may end up as something that we deem reportable, which it may not have been when we first started. So we definitely have a process in place.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful.
I agree. I also find that sometimes if somebody makes an error that isn't really reportable, it's not really much, but all of a sudden they make that error again or a
That's
third
true.
time. You know, now you start to, okay, this is a bigger picture, maybe whether it be just anal-specific or systemic, you know, so what appears to be something that could be minor, you know, you may reevaluate later on if it shows up again. So again, there is a process, I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Monroe.
Oh, wait. We have a question.
Okay.
I may have missed this, so I apologize, but in terms of secondary review, was that put in place as a result of this?
Yes, it was.
That's a good question.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Monroe.
So next,
Yes. Monroe County Office of the Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Lab has notified A&B and the Commission of an unexpected result on a PT. It's a quantitative result for carisoprodol outside of the laboratory's acceptable range. The lab investigated the issue and found that the vials used to prepare the calibrators had been previously opened, leading to the calibrators prepared at incorrect concentrations because of evaporation in the standard. 3 cases had been run since the last successful PT completion and found not to be affected after the review. The lab received replacement standards and reran the PT samples, finding they were consistent with the expected results. So the lab is available if you have questions regarding this action. Don't see any questions.
going once.
Going
I
once.
would just like to comment that I really appreciated the detailed analysis. Just, you know, it was helpful.
Thank you. Okay, Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner Division of Forensic Toxicology has a few items here as well. The first is a notification of an unexpected PT involving norfentanyl. The results were outside of the laboratory and PT providers' acceptance criteria. Quantitative reporting of norfentanyl has been suspended while the laboratory investigates the issue. The second item is a closeout of an investigation into an unexpected acetone PT, initially discussed at our June meeting. The lab has revised its method to include an additional calibrator and made revisions to the instrument method, and testing resumed on November 7th. The next item is the notification of a LCMS instruments out of service being repaired on, and the instrument was repaired and placed back into service. And finally, the final item is a notification and closure of an unexpected ethanol PT result that fell outside of the laboratory's acceptance criteria. The quantitative reporting of ethanol has been temporarily suspended as the lab investigates the issue. And then we did get the closure in your late documentation. So are there any questions for this lab regarding the 4?
I do. With respect to the LCMS repair, just a couple of things. One is it part of your standard operating procedures? Because the district attorney is obviously relying upon results from this particular LCMS to determine whether there's any correlation between the reason for the failure of the repair and the reliability of any other prior results, and are they memorialized in some way, communicated, the repair itself communicated to the district attorney's office?
Dr. Abella?
Hi, I'm just getting loaded up here. So, can you hear me okay?
I'm sorry about that. We only see your shadow.
I apologize.
It's the ghost of Christmas yet to come.
Yeah.
Wherever they have you sleep.
Doesn't really want to be.
Oh my God, that's great.
Doing the best I can here.
It's the light in back of you, that's why.
Part-time, Joe.
I see that. Yeah.
Oh my God.
So, I'm sorry, could you just repeat that? I was
So
trying to load up
with
a
respect to
little
the
bit.
LCMS repair that was done,
Yes.
do you have a procedure for examining when the repairs are done, whether there's any reliability issues or causes for the repair that might relate to pending cases? And are the repairs themselves to the LCMS documented and shared with the prosecutor's office in Nassau County? So they in turn can conduct their own analysis or provide that information to the defendant in cases where it would be appropriate under discovery statutes?
So for the first parts of your question, yes, all of this information is documented You know, and I guess you'd have to consider the level of the issue that we're talking about. In this case, this is a very minor routine issue. I don't know the exact nature of what caused the instrument to go down, but I would consider this to be more of an administrative thing. Something like, you know, the keyboard stopped working or something like that, where it's not really critical to the function of the instrument. Now, if we did find a scenario where the instrument was found to have been somehow, you know, affecting the reliability of the forensic result that may have been reported, that would rise to a different level, but that's not what occurred here. So I think we would have to make that decision on a, you know, on a case-by-case basis. But as I said, certainly all this information is well documented, and there's a verification process when the instrument is repaired. There's a verification process before it goes back into service to show that it's operating reliably.
Thank you.
Sure.
It's also part of the accreditation process too, so it's mandated.
Correct.
I've ever seen in your what to-do list.
Are there other questions for toxicology? All right. Hearing none. Up.
I will return to the shadows.
Sorry,
All of that?
lost my place. Office of Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Biology. Yes. So we have a couple of items here. The first item is an update regarding the case contamination issue first discussed at the September meeting. The Root Cause Analysis Committee has provided a report with recommendations for the lab, and the lab has distributed the report to the Executive Director of the New York State Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. The defense community has sent a letter to the laboratory director with questions regarding the issue. And then the next item is the notification and ANAB acknowledgement of unexpected results from the proficiency test. Bodily fluid identification result for semen was reported as inconclusive. The laboratory is determining follow-up measures. Any questions for the lab?
Yes.
We have members here.
No.
You're not freezing for nothing.
Thank you, Jack. You know, I don't like Joe.
Anybody have a first question or Bill?
Tim or to any of you assembled, could you explain to me the physical location of where the contamination occurred? Did it only involve one physical geographic section of the lab? I think I understood how it came to your attention
Yes.
based on the report.
Yes, it did. It was in our examination laboratory, that one laboratory.
Okay, so it's not, there may be disagreement about this, but it's not, in your judgment, a systemic lab-wide issue? It's just this concentrated area?
It's systemic lab-wide in the examination area, but it was not and is not systemic lab-wide. We have a big lab in the other areas where we do extraction and amplification and all those other laboratory processes.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word systemic. I would say, and I don't mean to parse words, it's something with the system that we saw based on the procedures that were in place. Sorry, Craig O'Connor, Deputy Director, Department of Forensic Biology. Should have introduced ourselves. But the space that Tim is talking about, we actually are fortunate enough to have the examination area on one floor, pre-amplification area on the next floor, and post-amplification on the third floor. So it was within the evidence examination area that these were taking place.
Do you have a DNA data bank of every employee in the lab?
Yes, we do, but this contamination wasn't where it was an analyst that was contaminating the evidence. It was case-to-case contamination. So an analyst was examining case number 1, and then DNA from case number 1 ended up on case number 2.
In reading the report, it was only low copy being tested after a high concentration?
That is what we observed, that I think all but perhaps one, it was high copy evidence that was examined first, mostly sexual assault kits where intimate samples from people were cut over and over again. So DNA from their oral swab, penile swab or vaginal swab, etc. And then the subsequent cases tended to be lower amounts of DNA. So cases like property crimes where it was like a rock used to break a window or handle of a cart that they found that people used to steal things. So yes.
With the exception of the example you gave, a sexual assault case where there might be significant amounts of bodily fluid, are you able to distinguish in examining an item whether it's going to be high copy or low copy?
We do have a general sense based upon what the case type is. We read the police paperwork, you have a sense of what the case type. So if it's a homicide, it depends. Are we looking at a weapon? Are we going to look at the weapon, the handle of the weapon, or are we looking at blood? So it kind of, you get a general sense like that. So
I read in the report, by the way, who was on the root cause analysis team that did this report?
generally when an RC committee is formed, so it's led by our root cause analysis officer, who is an employee in our laboratory. There's a member of forensic biology on it. There's members of other departments within the OCME, 2 or 3 others, and then a member of an outside agency who I believe was an employee from NYU.
The makeup of that committee is unknown to me.
Oh, really? Okay. I mean, do they physically come to the lab and interview
I don't
people?
even know where they hold their meetings.
The root cause analysis officer is an employee of the agency of OCME, but not of our department.
So in my informal polling of lab people, there appears to be different procedures throughout the state on what to use in examining an item, a scalpel versus scissors. You know, one person pointed out to me that scalpels are very dangerous and can lead to not only infection for the analyst, but for contamination of the, and they, for scissors, is there such a thing as disposable scissors? Or is that like some crazy?
That would be cost prohibitive.
You'd have to have,
I mean, they would have to be stainless steel.
100,000 pairs of stainless steel scissors.
We have a number of cut-resistant gloves that we've purchased that people use when they use the scalpels.
I didn't, forgive me for editorializing, I didn't buy into the bleach argument. I don't know, do you guys have feelings about that? Or?
It's undetermined at this point.
Pat, did you? I'm sorry.
I will just, in terms of my opinion, and I don't know how you're delivering your sodium hypochlorite, from a squirt bottle, 10%, or from the manufacturer that mixes the sodium hypochlorite and water separately when it pulls.
There's multiple. When the people set up their conical tubes for dipping and cleaning their tools, then we are preparing the solutions.
Okay.
But we do have squirt bottles as well, and the water and the bleach are kept separate, and then they're mixed with the spray.
Because I was going to say, sodium hypochlorite, it definitely does degrade, and as its concentration goes below 10%, it's a big deal. It's a really big deal. And that's why I usually recommend not squirt bottles unless you're putting the DOD on it, and you know that it's about a couple months old, 3 months, you set whatever protocol you want. But I like, and I know they're expensive. You guys are a big lab, but I love the bottle that has the 2 separate containers.
That's what we have.
That's about what we have. We've been using
We
that
don't
for
have the squirt bottle like you're saying.
Okay, all right.
And as Kira's saying, with the conicals, the analyst will prepare those fresh each time. So with the sodium hypochlorite, and then add the water to it to dilute it.
You drop down below a certain percent of sodium hypochlorite, that it's going to be an issue, especially when you're reusing the same instrument. So
I'm wrong. There is.
In my opinion, I think it's a big deal.
I was thinking more in terms of Heinz ketchup in my refrigerator.
No sugar added like
Really
mine.
close, yeah.
Okay, well, I'm glad I asked that. So, bottom line here is you have instituted new protocols regarding cleaning of instruments.
Yes.
And look, here's the $64,000 question for me. I mean, people are going to say, well, how do we know this hasn't happened thousands of times before? How do we know it's not happening in other parts of the lab, et cetera, et cetera? How would you respond to that?
So we've done an extensive look back, like it's mentioned in the RCA report. And just to be clear, I think we mentioned at the DNA subcommittee, the RCA committee does their report, but it's separate from our own investigation, right? Our own investigation is continuing on and looking back even further. So we've looked at these over 12,000 samples. It's been less, it's like 0.5% were affected from what we can see so far, and we're looking back further and even deeper to see if there's anything else. We did put the possible degraded bleach as a possibility because it seemed like it was sort of a concentration, like more in the summertime. Maybe there were some expired bottles or something in the lab that were not as effective. So we think it's sort of you know, like they mentioned, a few different causal factors together. But we're definitely looking back further in our investigation to see if it could have happened before.
And just from the report, no arrested cases, indicted cases, convicted cases were affected, correct?
Correct.
All the parties were notified, DA's office, defense bar.
Correct.
Okay, I'll now allow you to be eviscerated by the other wing of the Forensic Science Commission. I just like to say, I mean, and I'm teasing Jessica because she's my friend and she's going to have some very legitimate questions, I'm sure. I mean, look, we, the commission, we impose burdens on the labs. We don't provide costs to you. The government doesn't provide additional funding to you. In some cases, they actually do. There was an error. You caught it. You corrected it. And you're dealing with it. So.
I agree. I agree with Mr. Fitzpatrick. I did just want to ask, so you went through 4,000 cases, but you're continuing the look back. How did you go about going through, what was the review process? Was it?
Well, we queried our limbs and were able to make lists of cuttings that were done by individual examiners on individual days. So we had this big data set that we then distributed between senior analyst supervisors in the lab to look at the data from all the cuttings that one person did during a day over the time period of May through August. And they looked at the data from the first case of the day, compared it to the data from the second case of the day, and went down the line. And that was what we call the QC manual check. And we have documentation in the files of that. And that's how we found most of these instances. What we are currently still doing is designed another protocol utilizing StarMix, which will look at cases examined by the same examiner over a weekly period, or usually 5 days, but sometimes they work the weekend. And we look at what profiles were developed during that time, and then we're able to compare the mixtures through in StarMix in batch mode to generate any likelihood ratios, associations between profiles generated and any mixtures determined by cuttings from the same analyst during that week. And that's kind of another way to check the mixtures that was not, and another way to check contamination that spanned multiple days. Because what we asked individuals to do, humans to do, is to look at the data of one day all the way down the line, and they wouldn't necessarily see if something went from day 1 to day 2. And although they did discover, some people did find that, so that's why we knew we had to look further at over a more than just 1 day to second day period.
Can I follow up on that?
And we also did a search of our local database.
I was going to ask
well,
that, yeah.
And then with our sexual assault cases, if they're negative for male DNA, because we do screening, we wouldn't routinely type the victim exemplar. So we went back and typed all those victim exemplars and added that to the investigation, looking for that possibility of cross-contamination as well.
So it seems very, very thorough to me.
Thank you.
I just want to follow up on one thing. It occurred to me that were there cases where, I may be using the wrong term, but the high copy concentration of the DNA where a perpetrator was discovered, and then that perpetrator's DNA wound up contaminating a low copy case? Were the DAs informed that both cases had to be discarded? I mean, it seems to me that if the first case involved, for example, a rapist, I would prefer to take my chances at trial and explain to a jury that the contamination is irrelevant to the fact that the rapist's DNA was in the SANE kit from the victim. I don't know that, is that,
The DAs have been very well informed on what we're doing and how we're going about our practices. So, yeah, I mean, the decisions they make are beyond me, but that is
you don't know if they've
absolutely
made a
their
decision like that? Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it's typically we call it the contaminator versus a contaminated case. It's typically the contaminated case where we would then have to, reevaluate additional evidence, decide whether or not the sample would be used or not used. But the contaminator case, although they would be told that that case had contaminated subsequent cases, but that contaminator case, the evidence was good to go, basically.
Stephen has a question, and then Aaron, I'd like to recognize.
With respect to the process that you don't,
Okay.
I'm sorry?
Albany's after Aaron.
Okay, with
I'm
respect
Jeff.
to the processes that you just described, which are quite thorough, have you considered any changes to quality assurance going forward on any periodic basis using those same techniques to ensure reliability moving forward?
Yes, the process that she mentioned with the star mix analysis and checking multiple days, we originally developed that as our sort of corrective monitoring action, right? So we're taking a subset of cases every week, monitoring one examiner's cuttings for 3 days at a time, and checking those to see if there's any cross-contamination between cases. So that's our way of sort of monitoring, are our new protocols effective moving forward?
And that's effective now?
That's effective now, yes.
Aaron, are you all set?
Yes,
Okay.
that was the question.
Thanks. So I just want to preface my comments by saying, I think of this as among the most serious, if not most serious thing that can happen in a laboratory, because the forensic samples are not checkable in any way. We have to rely on the laboratory's reliability in order to know what was in those samples. I dispute the characteristic that this isn't a systemic problem. The limited review so far has already shown, I think you said 26 samples across 22 cases and 16 contamination events. 10 profiles, forensic profiles had to be removed from CODIS, 111 reports had to be amended, and we still don't really have a clear explanation as to what happened. So I do consider this very serious. I'm also concerned that although it's really much easier to track a contamination event from a high forensic template to a low forensic template, it's much more difficult to track a contamination event from a low forensic template to a high template because, of course, the very nature of a low template sample is such that the contamination will seem less evident. And yet, I think we all know in actual cases, it's not uncommon to ascribe a profile that's a partial or has some allele heights that are, different, especially in these mixture cases. You can absolutely see how contamination both ways could be an issue and yet a lot harder to catch in the low to high variation. On the bleaching point, it seemed as though that is kind of where you have landed as an explanatory, although I wasn't quite sure from the report because if I remember correctly, it said you tested the bleach and the bleach still worked. And so it felt a little inconsistent to say we think the problem might be the bleach. And I very much appreciate the expertise here that changing that practice just for safety's sake is a good one, but it didn't, if I take the report correctly, if I understood it right, the bleach, even though the concentration was lower than it needed to be, still functioned when you did like your own control tests. So is that accurate or did I misunderstand that? Which would suggest that it wasn't in fact the bleach.
The bleach that we had to test was not the same bleach that was used at the time of these incidents. That was one limitation that we had because what we did test was what was available in the lab at that time in August, but that we go through bleach so quickly, those were not the same bottles as from June and May.
I also, I wanted to, you brought up a few points in there. We are not attributing what happened solely to the bleach. If the bleach was in fact at that time, like Kira said, we can't test the bleach that was used at the time, but that is not our sole causal factor, nor was it found to be the sole
causal factor by the root cause analysis committee. There may be several causal factors that were at play all at once, or maybe one, that was the actual root. The root, we can't get to the root at this point. So we have addressed several different possibilities as the root in order to correct moving forward and enhance our quality system.
I appreciate that. I think I'm still just alarmed because we don't have a root is where I'm coming from. Let me ask a different set of questions. One is, how many analysts work on that floor approximately? Because there were 9 involved analysts. Are there 9 on the floor, or are there many more than that on the floor?
We have over 100 people that perform evidence examination at our laboratory. In any given day, we work on what's called a rotation system. So in any given day, you probably have 15 to 20 people in the room doing evidence examination. So I would imagine and their rotation is per week. So you would talk about 20 people per week would be in the evidence examination. Then they rotate. So in any given month, you could have 50 to 60 people. But like I said, we have over 100 analysts that perform evidence examination. So we look at it as 9 out of the 108 or number that it is. And it wasn't hundreds of amended reports. I believe you said that. It was nowhere near that. I believe the number was maybe less than 10 amended reports. And the 22 cases or 25 cases are out of almost 4,000 that we've looked at. So we're looking at less than 1% of the samples that we process in that 3-month time period that we detected contamination.
Apologies, I at that 111 number I thought I had from the materials, so I must have copied it incorrectly or misunderstood something. So just so I'm clear, the look back then isn't limited to those 9 analysts. The look back is more broadly across all the work that was done on that floor.
Correct. Yes.
And
everybody that has done evidence examination in those 3 months, their cuttings have been looked at.
So then what emerges interesting to me is the fact that I think somewhere in the materials you said that the 9 analysts were all trained in the 2022-2023 period. Do we know whether other analysts were trained in that period? I mean, is that an indication that perhaps something was going on in the training, or anything that helps isolate the 9 analysts from the 108 more broadly, or certainly the 60 or whatever you say are on the floor?
We did look at that. I personally looked at that, the training classes, and it was randomly distributed. We hire and train a lot of people, especially during that time, because we had some attrition, we had some new hires to bring on, and there was no correlation or distinction between training class and those 9 analysts.
And what about, I know you conducted a survey, which I thought was very helpful, of practices. Have you tried to correlate the answers of those 9 analysts to the broader survey questions? So for instance, I think at one point it was something like 19% of analysts change their bench paper whenever it's in their judgment when needed, as opposed to every case. And were you able to determine whether those 9 analysts gave similar answers to some of those questions that might also help pinpoint a root cause here?
We did look at that, and we gave that information also to the root cause analysis committee, and they looked at it. We didn't see an exact lineup with those particular 9 analysts, right? So we didn't necessarily find something that was specific to any one thing, but in general, one of the things that we think was a potential contributing cause was just sort of they were all kind of doing things differently when we did those surveys, right? Like everybody was doing things just a little bit differently, whether it be on one thing or multiple things. And so that's one of the things that we put into place now, is to make it a very standardized protocol so everyone is doing the best practice the same way moving forward.
So there's nothing that is emerging about these 9 analysts that might explain why they were experiencing I mean, they weren't uniquely assigned. I know you have just now undertaken to separate the high template and the low template, et cetera, which I think is a best practice and is wise, but there was nothing about like where they were assigned or anything that might help pinpoint why they were having contamination issues.
We wish there were. We wish we did find something like that we could attribute it to and just fix that one thing. But that's why, since, as Tiffany said, since there was some variability in what people said they were doing as cleaning protocol, the best remedy was to standardize at what everyone is doing, including us. We all had to go down and get retrained in the altered way of examining evidence and cleaning tools and using scalpels, so that everyone is now doing the same thing.
If we were able to, if we or even the root cause analysis committee was able to determine a more pinpointed root cause, it would surely focus our investigation much narrower than we've had to perform to date, which is why it's just a very broad investigation covering as many different areas as we could possibly think of that could possibly be the root. In order to ensure that we are, the data that's been released from the laboratory is as accurate as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. There's a double-edged sword here, which is obviously thoroughness of the investigation is essential and to be commended. It's alarming that it's not revealing a cause. It's alarming to me that it's not revealing a cause, because if we don't know why, and again, this is different from 1, 2 analysts, when I look at 9 analysts across a number of cases in a period from May to August, a fairly short period, it's really disconcerting. And I think that's disconcerting because I'm glad that you were looking back further. I think there's no reason, I'm not sure I have any reason to believe that this is a problem that began in May. To the extent that there weren't any convictions or matches, I'm not terribly surprised, because, the samples only went in at some point after May, presumably. They've only been in a short period of time. We don't know if going back further, even if just to 2022, when these analysts came on board, I guess, all the 9 that are involved, assuming it's limited to these 9, we don't know if there are cases from much earlier that also have these contamination events. In addition, I'm glad to hear you're doing the STAR mix protocol, because I think it's going to be hard to manually detect this kind of contamination, again, especially when we're dealing with forensic profiles where we don't know a ground truth other than what the testing reveals to us. So, I'll pass it over to someone else because there may be other questions, but I'm still really unsatisfied with not having really any idea why this is happening across so many analysts in so many cases, because it both makes me gravely concerned about what other cases may be out there preceding this period. I don't even have an explanation for why May 1st would be the start date, as it were. And it also makes me concerned going forward that the important and essential correctives that are in place will actually be able to correct whatever mysterious cause is out there.
We would like to remind the committee that we are continuing this. We're not finished. We are continuing, and we are going back further than May. And although we don't have a single root cause, we have several causal factors that we do believe, point to what's going on here, which is a combination of perhaps bleach that wasn't as strong as it could have been or should have been, and inconsistent cleaning practices. So, but again, we are going back and we're continuing to look.
Did you start using that bleach in May? Is this bleach protocol new as of May of this year?
The protocol is not new, but every bottle, every lot of bleach is new, and we go through pallets of bleach, believe it or not. We go through pallets of bleach.
My concern is that if your explanation is the bleach, then from the moment you began DNA testing, contamination could be an issue, because the bleach practices are the cause of contamination. I mean, this is...
If it was just the bleach, we would have seen more.
It's not a single cause.
There is a question in Albany.
Yeah.
can we move to a specific, I believe Bev, you had a question?
Yeah, it's actually more of a comment than a question. For those of you that aren't aware, the New York State Department of Health regulates privately owned forensic laboratories. And we have had a requirement for the low copy DNA specimens to be separated during evidence examination for a very long time. So I'm actually was quite surprised to see that that wasn't standard practice in the public laboratories in New York.
Maybe there should be an examination of the rest of that protocol.
I have a question as well. In your updated training, you indicate examiners must replace 10% bleach, water, and 70% ethanol solutions daily. Is there anything about looking at, I assume these are made from a concentrated stock bleach solution, back at the concentrated solution on how long it's maintained?
We take the bleach directly from the bottle, which is between 5 and 6% sodium hypochlorite. Of that percentage of sodium hypochlorite, we dilute it 1 to 10 in water. So that's 10% bleach. That's how 10% bleach is created in the lab.
So you're saying you're replacing that 10% bleach solution,
Correct.
but do you have any protocol for how long you maintain that concentrated bleach solution that you're making the 10% from? Because it's also degrading.
Yeah, once it's opened, it's used. I mean, we go through gallons of bleach every day, so we don't really maintain open bottles of bleach.
We are monitoring that now. That was one of the remedy actions that we put in place, that we're tracking the bleach bottles in LIMS, so we know which ones are open and which ones are being used. From guidance from the company, we're making sure that we're only using ones within the expiration date.
So the pallets that you have, you're also following those and making sure that expired bleach is removed before it's brought in and open.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to start by acknowledging, as others have, the challenge that you're facing. You're the highest throughput lab in the country, or one of them, right? And it's ongoing, and you have tons of cases, and all of New York City depends on you. So I just want to acknowledge that challenge. I also want to acknowledge that you have met with the Defense Bar. We found it an extremely helpful meeting. I hope you will continue those, since, as we've heard, this investigation is ongoing. Now that that's out of the way, I have a bunch of questions for you. One thing just to make clear, so there is a root cause analysis committee that is convened under local New York City legislation, and we have a copy of that report. My understanding is that FBio is doing its own root cause analysis, or am I wrong?
We're doing our own investigation into evaluation of cases to see which cases are affected.
Okay. Is that formalized in a report that some will be released, or?
A summary of it, yes, will be released once it's complete.
Okay. I certainly think parties would be interested in seeing underlying data. Okay, that's one question. Let me clear up one other thing before I get to my main questions for you. The use of StarMix. Are you using it only prospectively now to investigate and evaluate the efficacy of your corrective action? Or are you using StarMix now in your look back with, I think you call what was a QC manual check, using StarMix to go in the past, or just going forward?
It's for both.
It is for both?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so my main question is this, and I'll have some more about the use of StarMix, but thank you, that's helpful, and I'm interested in some more specifics. But I want to ask you about how you determined the efficacy and how you evaluated, how you would go back in the past to catch the contamination. How did you plan to do that, and how did you evaluate the success of what you were doing, right? Because we've heard other commissioners ask about different factors, and you've come up with, some factors that you did consider, but I think it's important to acknowledge the limitations of your look back. Right, so you said, and I just want to be very clear about what you did and didn't do. You looked at the work of one analyst over the period of how much time? One by one analyst, like you would take You would go through you'd have the LIMS system print out all their casework for that day. You would look at the profiles that were deconvoluted or separated out, and you would compare them with every case that one analyst did that day, just for one day. I think you said you expanded it. Can you just answer that first question?
I mean, we looked at every examiner and every day of exam that had occurred from May to August. We started there because the first instances we found were in June. And so we went 1 month behind and 1 month forward, right? So we wanted to sort of bracket that and see if it was beyond that time frame. So, but we looked at every cutting that was made from May to August for every examiner that made any cuttings. So that's how we got to the 4,000 cases and the 12,000 samples. And they did look originally manually 1 day at a time. We've now started applying that StarMix procedure. If you're asking about sort of efficacy of those checks, we have applied that StarMix procedure to not every single sample, but a subset, and we haven't found any new confirmed contaminations using that. So we think that the QC checks were very effective.
So you're using StarMix actually also to evaluate the effectiveness of the manual human eyeball going through all this stuff. Are you doing it on all cases? You said a subset. How are you selecting those cases that you're using StarMix to check?
Some of them were on days when we already knew there was a contamination event to sort of check all the every single case, make sure we didn't miss one in that day. And then some of them were randomly selected from the time period.
Are you using a statistician to assist you with this design of how you're going about this? Do you have a statistician on staff? Not right now.
Not at
I know
this
you
time,
have
yeah.
in the past.
Yeah,
That's
not
why.
at this time.
Okay. Okay. So and I think some of the other commissioners actually raised this sort of like thinking about the kinds of contamination you're actually going to find, right? Because you're not going to find what you're not looking for. So are you doing anything to evaluate analyst to analyst, like different analysts' contamination? Or is it just one analyst? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yes. So that would be what we were using our local database, like we mentioned, like looking across local database, evaluating those hits to see if we saw anything from analyst to analyst. We have not seen anything like that to date.
So when you use your local database, so isn't that only looking at cases from which you can identify or separate out, tease out an individual DNA profile? So, right, so you're not looking at the sum total of cases, only those where there was a profile sufficiently strong enough to upload into the LDIS or CODIS system to check. Okay. So how many, I guess, and maybe you don't have the number off the top of your head, but how many cases are you missing? Because that is how you're looking at it. Do you know what I mean? It's important to know that in determining what.
Well, can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
How would, I mean, in the exam area, each 6 foot by 6 foot square table, all spread out. We have a big lab. They open their evidence, they examine their evidence, they close their evidence, and they send it back to the evidence storage location. So, 20 feet down the road, are you suggesting that, I could contaminate evidence 20 feet down the road?
Yeah, I'm suggesting you check. There have
We are
been studies.
checking,
There
and we've
have been
shown
studies that show DNA travels, right? And there have been, I think, out of I don't know if it was Australia. I don't want to misquote a study, but I'm pretty certain there has research where there's a program of environmental monitoring. So you actually go about the lab, and that's one of my questions is, are you going to institute that? And you swab certain areas in the laboratory. You'd focus maybe on high throughput areas of the lab or whatever is appropriate. And you can see that DNA profiles will travel around the lab. That's not surprising. But I don't, let's hope that isn't possible, right? To see if it's possible. And there is work out there in I know Switzerland. There are definitely studies out there where they have found that DNA is going to travel around a laboratory. I mean, I don't know.
Jessica,
but
can
you
I
need to.
just jump in? Because
Please.
if
Sure.
we were on the stand and we were to say there were studies out there, then you'd want to give us the documentation for us to review to say, are you familiar with this? So I would request the same thing, that if there are studies out there that say that DNA profiles are flying around the laboratory, then sure, that's a problem. But I don't think that's what's happening.
It may not be, and probably even if it
And-
did happen, it would be very low
and-
incidence, but you have to check it.
And what we, listen, there's all kinds of different spot checks that we are doing on a constant basis, and it may not be to the specificity of what you're describing at the moment, but, you know, just listening to all of these preventative measures is going to have a chilling effect on our ability to process samples. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't do anything and that we should just, you know, put on blinders and, you know, see no evil, close our ears. No, I don't believe it's happening. But we are doing what we can to respond. OCME is incredibly fortunate that they have the people power to do the type of work. I mean, they've done more work on their look back than I've gotten in my entire laboratory for a year, or maybe even 2 years, or 3 years. So, I mean, it's incredible what they've been able to accomplish. So I'm just kind of thinking about the smaller laboratories and what the impact on us would be if we had to also try to worry about things that possibly didn't happen. I mean, I don't want to say that we're not, you know, I don't want to just be reactive. I would like to be. You're asking us to be proactive so that we, and I get frustrated about, you know, being in a reactive mode a lot when I would prefer to be proactive. But sometimes we can only kind of do these look backs, and then OCME did describe that they've got a new process in place. So we might not be able to tell everything that happened that went in the past, but now they can use their new processes hopefully to determine whether what they're instituting is going to fix this problem. And so they talked about causal factors and not that pinpointing factor, but maybe you can't pinpoint everything. We all do our own version of a root cause, and we try to get to that thing. And I understand the frustration when it's like, well, we can't figure out the thing. So they can't figure out the thing, but they've got a few things that they're trying that maybe will encompass the thing without them ever being able to say, this was the thing, but maybe it was in this group of things. And so we've addressed it. So it's a lot.
No, I hear what you're saying, Lydia, but I think it's important then to understand, and this is just one example, there are other limitations to the look back, and I think it's important to acknowledge those. Because if the look back is limited in a certain way, and maybe for policy reasons, you just can't get to the other stuff. But it is a decision, and it means certain data is not being looked at, and we just have to recognize that. So the analyst to analyst contamination is one thing, but there are others. It's the time period around that you're looking at, and I think it was in our materials, or it may have been at the Defender meeting, you said that one of the instances of contamination was 3 days later, right? The contaminating sample was examined, and 3 days later, that sample contaminated another evidence item. I don't want to misspeak, is that correct?
It was on the third day, so.
On the third day.
Evidence examined on day 1.
Yep.
Contaminant found on day 2 and day 3.
And day 3 was the contamination
And
event?
on both days.
Oh, on both days, I'm sorry. Okay. So in your look back to discover instances of contamination, of course, this would apply look forward. What is your day range? Are you only looking within 1 day, or are you going to expand it? I think you said you did expand it, but.
In the look back, we're looking at a week-long period. So Sunday through Saturday.
Okay.
For the individuals.
Yeah, and then for the future monitoring, it's 3-day periods at a time. So it's 3 days at a time.
Okay. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
In these exam rooms, they're obviously in a secure facility. Can they be locked? Is evidence left in there in the custody of the analyst who's working on it? Or at the end of every day, is it put away?
It's put away.
Yeah.
Yeah, put away and into locked storage, yeah.
I just, for time purposes, we have 5 more labs to discuss. And we're going to hear about this more, and there's more work happening. Is there any other, like a wrap up?
I'll wrap it up.
Yeah.
So and another huge one is mix to mix, right? You're not looking at mixture to mixture contamination, even though some non-deconvolutable mixtures are high template. Maybe that's a very small fraction of the cases, right? but they do exist. So that is a limitation. And I guess it's helpful for us to figure out how confident you are that you are capturing the universe of contamination, both looking back and in evaluating the efficacy of your method for catching contamination going forward, is to look at all these factors. And because we are concerned that you're not doing mix to mix. So just a couple more comments. We have talked about this in the past, but StarMix does have the mix to mix capacity. I know you've issued a memo explaining why you would not do that, because it requires validation that would take months. But this is going on for months. So now might be the time to validate that capacity that the software you already have in your laboratory can do and assist, because otherwise you're just ignoring an entire segment of cases that could be cross-contaminating, and we just don't know it, even though you have the capacity, once you validate it, to do that work. So, that's one suggestion. I do have a couple specific questions about you.
Just to address that
Yeah,
quickly,
please.
we're not
please,
ignoring
Dr.
those samples.
Sorry?
We're not ignoring those samples at all. We
How are
certainly
you
have
not ignoring?
considered them.
Okay.
And during the manual checks, that was something that the analysts were instructed to look at our mixtures that were from samples cut on the same day, and if they had alleles in common. So we've certainly acknowledged that that is a possibility of the mixture contamination, and we're still trying to address that concern. And from the memo from our technical leader, the point of validating, or the process of validating it, is not the sole reason why we're not currently using that mixture tool within StarMix.
What are the other reasons?
So the main reason, as I outlined in the letter that you referred to, is when we looked at the contamination events that have happened so far, we were talking about samples predominantly from sexual assault kits, like Kira mentioned, from these intimate samples that had hundreds of thousands of picograms of DNA, right? And then you would see such a very small fraction of that carry over to the next sample. So and I think Aaron mentioned earlier, sort of a low template contaminating to a high template, the tools they were attempting to clean them, right? Maybe they weren't perfectly clean for some potential causal factor. We're not exactly sure which one, or if it's multiple. Did get rid of most of the DNA that could potentially contaminate to the next sample, right? So if you're starting out with a sample that is a low template mixture, it should be cleaned off, right, by the next time you go to another sample. What we were seeing, and we did see, donor profiles from these high template samples contribute to a mixture that we were able to detect through these manual checks, et cetera, to see that within a mixture at a low level, right, from the high template to low level. So we think for this purpose, the way that we're using StarMix, taking a donor profile, comparing it to mixtures, as opposed to trying to compare every low template mixture to every low template mixture, is effective for our investigation.
Yeah, the concern, I understand that makes sense, that theory makes complete sense, and, you've made observations, but you're not gonna know unless you check, right? And that's what we're concerned about, is missing cases of contamination. You have implemented online I can't remember the name of the form, but it's an opportunity for prosecutors, defense attorneys on behalf of our clients to request the laboratory to do a contamination check. There's some lack of clarity about the limitations. I know you list the type of samples that will not be like an elimination or something. What about the time period? What date range will you not check for contamination, or is there not one? Can we request any case?
At this point, we don't have a specific date range. If it's after we've implemented our new protocol, so after August, right, we're doing the routine monitoring on there. So I don't know that we're granting those, like if it's something that happened, a case that we examined last week, because that is going under routine monitoring. But the further back, we will consider any date at this point.
And when you say we, you mean as a defense attorney or as a commission?
Oh, well, I'm speaking, I am on the commission, but yes, this concern is absolutely shared by the defense community.
No, you said we. I was just clarifying whether you meant we requesting it as a defense attorney or as the commission requesting it.
speaking on behalf of the Public Defense Bar. Yeah, yeah. So, but I guess I'm questioning why you won't do a contamination check or on cases post-August. I know, and tell me if I'm wrong, but the rationale is because we've already implemented these changes, but if we don't truly know the cause of the contamination, then how can we be, do you know what I mean? Like if you can't say for sure what's causing it, it could still be going on. You are doing a QC monitoring to do spot checks or contamination. But I think given all the uncertainty and the fact your investigation is still going on, that we should be allowed to request a contamination check for cases after August.
We may not have been able to, or the root cause analysis committee have been able to pinpoint the precise cause yet, or potentially ever. But there's only you know, a very limited universe of things it could possibly be. I mean, barring DNA profiles jumping around the room, we did, you know, separate out our areas of examination. We have trained everyone in new cleaning protocols. We've implemented a process through StarMix to check profiles. I mean, we've addressed enough areas that we think that we would be able to detect if something in the future was able to occur. And again, I just want to make sure that it's, you know, we reiterate again, our laboratory caught this issue with our own quality control process that we already had in place. And so, you know, we of course always room for improvement, and we've made improvements, and we just have to see now that moving forward, those improvements are working. So far, it seems that way with our QC checks that we're doing. So as of right now, it looks like what we've implemented is working until such time as that, you know, doesn't seem to be the case. We of course would improve at that point as well.
Just to be clear, you're saying it's working based on your QC monitoring program, which involves randomly selecting 2 analysts to evaluate their casework for a week using the StarMix batch mode, or did I misstate that?
So in addition to the way that we're using StarMix for our QC monitoring, we've also implemented cleaning procedures. We're also tracking our bleach now, making sure that it's not expired, there is no expired, tracking when it will expire, you know, just really have boosted everything.
Increased exam supervision, they're using more disposable tools, like there's just so many things that we put into place.
Sure. Yeah, sorry, I was just
And that's on
referring on
top of the-
whether evaluating cases
Right. And-
to see if it's all those things, then you have instituted a lot are working.
Right, and that's on top of the QC procedures, like Mary said, that we already had in place. So those contamination checks had already been taking place. This is just these specific areas that we have bolstered in order to look at this investigation to see that the factors that we're trying to look at are working.
At this point, I think we do need to move on for time and wrap this up, because you will be back in March.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just jump in to say that I'm happy to provide research on the point that was raised earlier. There's 20 years of research about contamination in labs.
Thank you. Okay. Our next lab is the New York City Police Department latent print section. They have 2 items up for review by the commission. The first is a closeout of lost evidence, first discussed at the September meeting. The latent print section was searched and the evidence could not be located. Several process improvements were put into place to prevent reoccurrence. The second item is an initial notification of differing conclusions following re-examination of a case. The lab notified the detective who requested the re-examination and is continuing to investigate this situation. Questions for the laboratory?
We're
NYPD latent print.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Actually, right here in person.
Hi, how are you? So just to make sure I understand, there's an initial notification that a reanalysis of a cold hit differed. Not only was one of the prints that had originally been found of value, the new examination or new analyst said not of value. And then the second print from 94, that there was a conclusion that the victim was identified as the person who left that print. Now there is an exclusion. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. What is your, and I know this is ongoing and just an initial notification, but what is your procedure when there is disagreement? Maybe it's different when you're looking back so long ago, but what is the protocol when there is a disagreement among analysts?
So if it's involving current analysts, the procedure is to do a group consultation, see if they can come to an agreement on the disagreement, talk through the problem or talk through the issues. And then if they cannot come to an agreement, it goes to an additional technical leader as a third party to look at, and then the discussion continues. And then if something cannot be, if they cannot come to an agreement, then it is usually up to the director of the laboratory to decide at that point what happens. Oftentimes, the case will just go back to the original examiner if that's the sort of the majority feeling is the correct answer, or it could be reassigned to a different examiner. And that's the current protocol now. But in this situation, of course, the original examiner is not here. So our protocol for that has always just been to re-examine the case in full. And then so if then there was a disagreement among the current staff, it would move to the disagreement procedure. But there was no disagreement with the current staff.
So you're not having like an extra analyst look at it, given there's a disagreement from back in 94? You're
I
treating
did
it as-
actually, I did have an extra one look at it. So normally for an exclusion, we only have two people look at it, the examiner and the verifier. But because there was a disagreement, I gave it to another technical leader to take a look at it to get a third opinion.
And I understand you reached out to the case detective and there's been no arrest on the case, but all of this would find its way into the case file.
Of course.
And there would be an indication on the case report that there was more information in a case file that would contain this info. Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Albany? Okay. Thank you. The New York State Police Crime Laboratory, there's two items here. The first item is the closeout of a lost PT item in the biological sciences section, first discussed at the September meeting. A meeting was held with the section serologist to discuss best practices when handling hairs and fibers. The second item is a closeout of an incorrect association of an offender sample, also discussed at the September meeting. If there's any questions for the laboratory. Seeing none. Okay, Westchester County Departments of Labs and Research Division of Forensic Science. Two items here. The first is a notification of an unexpected result from a digital evidence proficiency test. The analyst took a pre-distribution of the same test and utilized the same answers in the formal test. Analysts were reminded that when a pre-distribution test is taken, they should be aware that the formal test may be different. The procedure manual was also updated. And a review of 2 years of casework showed that properties of videos like those evaluated for the PT were not requested or reported in casework. The second item is a notification of an unexpected result on a gunshot residue proficiency test. ANAB acknowledged the notification and requested additional information. All analysts followed laboratory procedures and felt that the instructions were too broad and no further action will be taken. If there are questions for the laboratory, we have members virtual who could join. I see a hand up, Aaron and Mike. Aaron, would you like to start this time?
No, it's fine if Mike wants to go first.
Okay. There should be people joining. I think
There
Lindsay's-
should be, they all should be virtual except for me.
So I guess my question is, what's a pre-distribution test?
Okay.
You do that one.
We can answer that.
Well, I'll let my QA manager, Jennifer Riley, answer that question.
Yes, a pre-distribution test is when the vendor asks if we would be willing to participate and take the test before it's normally distributed and then submit the results.
And do pre-distributions tests change? Obviously they do, right?
Well, we were under the impression they do not change. So in the past, when we've done it, they've never changed, at least when we participated. So I think it seems as though it depends on the test that you're partaking in. So like in DNA, the test never changed. But in this case, the pre-distribution test consisted of 2 different types of files, of which the analysts had to determine if they were the same. And then they did. And then they were instructed to only proceed with one of those files. But then when so then we submitted the results. Then when the normal distribution test was sent out, they informed us that the instructions were a little different and they only wanted us to look at one of the files.
I guess my concern is why would someone take the pre-distribution results and put them into the PT? Isn't that what happened? Isn't, right? Didn't it say, excuse me, the pre-distribution results, trying to find my notes here. The pre-distribution results were used on the PT that was taken, is that correct?
Correct. Because when the analyst was looking at the 2 files, they determined that they were the same exact file. They used a technique to determine the hash values.
Right.
So they determined that they were the same exact files and then used all those values for the other file.
Got it. Okay. All right.
But that may have been, they did that analysis in the pre-distribution. Did they ever actually look at the video in the actual PT and analyze that video?
The 2 files, the file that was received in the normal PT was compared with the other one to determine it was the same, correct? Mm-hmm. Correct.
So they compared it to the pre-distribution file rather than analyzing it as a sample of its own.
Yes.
Why?
Because they thought the properties would have been all the same based on the fact that the file was exactly the same. So the file was in what we call a container. It was in a different file format. So they determined that the exact file within it was the same.
Thank you.
Any, yes, Erin?
Yeah, this follows up on that and also relates to the second issue. So, I mean, a pre-distribution test, especially if the assumption until this one is that it'll be identical to the proficiency test, doesn't it undermine the point of the proficiency test to essentially give the exact same test before you give the test?
Well, no. So the pre-distribution test, when you're asked, they basically state to you that you can use those same results. They tell us you have to submit your results through the group, like the formal PT, for it to be considered, sent out to the external accreditation agency to be part of the summary report. So for instance, in the DNA test, it's not like they get the samples again and have to reanalyze them.
So the pre-distribution test is essentially the proficiency test. It's just the way that they do it. They're basically like, we're going to give it to you, you do it, and then you submit your answers again later.
Correct.
Okay, that's a good clarification.
Yes. That's a really important clarification. Yeah.
Very important clarification. You should have led with that.
The proficiency test provider often gives the pre-distribution to a select
Screening it.
Screen it,
Screen
make
it.
sure
That
it
makes
works.
sense.
And
Guinea
then
pigs. But then
all
they don't make
things
you do
are
it
a
again.
go,
Right.
that same test goes out in normal distribution.
So 2 things on that. I mean, One is, this seems like a failure of the proficiency test. If they're explicitly telling you essentially this is your test and, you should be able to take for granted it's the same test, that's a problem with this vendor or with this model that they essentially changed the answers without alerting anyone. So,
Absolutely.
that's a concern. And then the second is relates to the second piece, which maybe also is I also appreciated the thoroughness of this, although I'm not sure I totally followed it. So apologies if I misunderstood. But if I understood correctly, there's no policy that during a this is related to the analysts who, the drop-down menu didn't have the option that mirrors the protocol they follow. And so they had the tech reviewer look it over, et cetera. And if I understood correctly, they spoke to, during the proficiency test, the analysts are allowed to confer with one another. And then, the tech review process came in. And if I understood ANAB's response, they said you shouldn't involve tech review essentially in the proficiency process, which if I'm understanding that correctly makes sense to me. But if I understood the form right, it also said there was no policy that prevented the analysts taking the tests from communicating with each other. And that too seems to undermine the point of the proficiency test because, even in sort of the best world where it's not copying or cheating or relying on your friend who can do the work better than you, it will also potentially just, undermine the accuracy of the results if this person's dependent on the ability to have a conversation with another person in order to perform the test well. So did I understand all that right? Or
actually, so we did have a conversation with our accreditation manager from ANAB. So I do think she, once we spoke with her, she realized that we were not, or I should say, our analysts do not speak to each other. The analysts that are taking the PT, they do not speak to each other when they're taking the PT. And to be honest, and to also be clear, the tests are locked in our LIMS system, so they can't even, try to look at someone else's PT because we locked the tests. What happened was because they didn't know how to answer the question on the report. Now, I should also say, when they finished their PT, they wrote the report in our LIMS system. So they were finished with the PT. It's the part when they got to the questionnaire for the vendor, they didn't know how to complete that question because it said positive, negative, inconclusive. So then when all of the tests went to the technical reviewer, who also happens to be the supervisor, that's when it was decided how to answer that, in addition to adding the comment at the end. And that is why the comment at the end is the same.
So they weren't, I got the comment part, but so they weren't, I thought I had understood the report to say they were also discussing it with each other. Like, we don't know what to put because okay. So it was only just that the tech reviewer, was trying to reconcile the results that the protocols demanded with the results options given by ANAB. And that is why there was this same answer kind of problem across the three tests. Got it.
Their reports in the LIMS system follow the procedure manual and is slightly different in terms of how many particles each one saw. So it really had to do with the way the questionnaire was worded.
Got it.
Can I clarify that this conversation is covering two different proficiency tests? We started off talking about the video test, and now this is talking about the GSR.
Which one are we on?
That was the GSR that they were just discussing.
GSR. Apologies. I jumped ahead, I guess. That's all I had. Thank you.
You have a question, Pat?
Just a quick question. Does anyone know if they ever, not they, the proficiency test providers ever put out, let's say, something with lead-free, like a lead-free primer, so that you would only expect the antimony and also the barium? Like at some, does anybody say, all right, rather than the 3 particles, if we get 2, do we call it, and I have no experience in firearms, does any laboratory call 2 of 3 particles positive for GSR?
I think, Ron, based on the summer report that we looked through, they did not, correct?
Yes, that's correct. So the ASTM standards has 2 categories of GSR particles. First is characteristic particles and consistent particles. So what you're referring to are the consistent particles, which are the 2 element particles. So in the ASTM, these are consistent, but it could come from other sources. So that's why our protocol is to request a cartridge to see if they could potentially come from 2-element particles. Now, we did look at the, there was another a participant who actually had a binary 2-element particles as well, and they concluded as inconclusive as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions for the lab on either of these PTs? Okay, thank you. Westchester County Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory has a notification of an unexpected result on a digital evidence proficiency test. The lab investigated and found that they had not used the most current version of software during analysis. The laboratory updated the software and was able to achieve a consensus result. Are there any questions for the lab on this notification? Okay, seeing. Nope.
It's not cold out
Oh, I
there.
missed toxicology.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, forensic tox.
I missed that. I just, you want me to, you
Yes.
want to go backwards or finish this one and then we'll go back to the one I
I say we
skipped?
finish this one.
Okay, since I've thrown that out there. Then Aaron has a question. And we have the lab, and then we'll go back.
Oh, crime lab. Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Aaron.
Hi. So, you know, I was a little confused by the report because I had trouble understanding why the software had not been updated. And, you know, I think especially at one point you described that, you know, that you guys pay tens of thousands of dollars to keep it updated. And it's a really changing fast field that requires updating. And so that seemed, you know, inconsistent with it being not a big deal to update. And I'm just kind of wondering if you could explain that to me.
Well, that's a good question, and you know, good afternoon. We don't roll out updates until we can verify and validate them and test them that they're going to produce reliable results. So just because a new piece of software has been updated or release is available, doesn't mean we immediately adopt it. We do kind of check for consistency out in the field and internally when we have the time between casework to roll out that validation. So it's not something that we do automatically. In our experience too, I don't know how familiar you are with the report that I sent up. I know you have a lot of these to go through. But particularly in digital evidence, you know, to kind of piggyback off of the last lab, there's a couple issues and problems at play there. We have specifically encountered where we use software that was more updated than what was used for the original PT and got an unintended result or an inconsistent answer. When we reverted back to the old software, we did achieve the correct answer. So we're not that dependent on the exact version for the purposes of the artificial part of the exam.
So, I mean, if that latter scenario had happened, then I would critique the tester because that is the tester not being up to date. But when it's the reverse, I'm concerned, especially because if I understood correctly, the result is that the PT reported 7 times something was accessed when the correct quote unquote answer was 1 time it was accessed. And I can imagine that being a pretty significant, you know, result, a significant finding in an actual case. Do you have a sense of, I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, but when the software was released that you were using versus when the software update, you know, patch or whatever it was that changed the results essentially came in? Like what kind of lag time are we talking weeks? Are we talking months?
I did some digging online on QA and it was hard to tell from this company itself. It could have been anywhere between a couple of weeks to a couple of months from when we took the PT to versus when we got the unexpected results. So it's hard to tell with them.
And they have so many results. You know, if you look at the numerology of how this is listed, you know, there may be a wide variation, and maybe only 3 results actually got published out of the hundreds of beta tests they did in the background. So they don't always produce that information or release that information rather. But it also should be noted that for the PT provider, I'm not trying to shift blame to them or anything for this. The tools, the forensic software tools they use to validate the test are not tools that we would encounter or use. And the tests are designed or intended to be software independent, tool independent. You know, they're intended. It doesn't mean it's always going to work out that way. So when we used a different version, you know, we got the right answers, and I deemed that for the purposes of this test, how artificial it is, we passed it.
Well, but just so I'm understanding, I mean, in this case, it wasn't like, oh, they use a different software package and that software package gave one answer and we use a better design software package and our software package gave a different answer. Your software package, if properly updated, gave the same answer as the tool they were using. Am I right? You got to one once you updated the software that you have chosen to use as opposed to the one that they use. The reason I care about this is that, you know, I do think it's important to stay in this. I agree with your assessment that digital forensics is a very fast moving field. And whereas in other fields, you can imagine updates are less essential, this does strike me as one. I mean, there's, you know, you likened it at one point to your sort of iPhone patch. And I had kind of the opposite reaction, which is, you know, yeah, sometimes the iPhone patches, you get like a new emoji, but sometimes the iPhone patch is there's a serious compromise thing happening and there's a security breach that you absolutely want to be patching. And, you know, it's not like Apple always tells you this one, you definitely want to patch. And this one, you know, really this is about a new emoji. And so, or people don't check that. But in your field, it strikes me that the practice you described of only doing updates when the kind of big digit changes in the front of the version, I'm not sure is the best practice, and this test suggests maybe it's not, and staying more updated is advisable, although I do appreciate the validation concern and that, you know, maybe part of the answer is better communication with the provider to understand the difference between the emoji update and the real update rather than relying on this numerical system as a proxy.
So I went through looking for the update notes for both versions, and there was nothing in there about saying, oh, this is important because we found this big problem of this doesn't parse this right.
Yeah, and
so it was just like, oh, we tipped and tweaked and changed the workflow. It was basically what they said for what the version we use versus the other version was essentially. They didn't say anything like, oh, make sure you update to this because there's other ones. And at the same point, talking to our analysts who are on separate forums that the software company uses, even sometimes they'll push an update out and then a couple people try and be like, oh, don't do that one yet because it has bugs in it. They're doing another update after it. So without more transparency either from the software company or the PT provider say, oh, we use this version to do this. And so it's like, okay, so
yeah,
if you fall ahead or downgrade.
Yeah, I totally hear you on that. I think I would just say, you know, if to the extent that it's helpful to say I got yelled at by a member of the commission, thanks to you guys having bad communication policies, and please, you know, communicate better. I would be happy to be an aid in that process of them enhancing their communications about essential updates.
We appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you. Any further questions for the laboratory? Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Now we'll go backwards.
Thanks, Jim.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Same people. No, not the same people. Same county. I missed them because all the Westchester labs are here. This is Westchester County Department of Labs and Research, Forensic Toxicology. 2 items. The first is an initial notification of an unexpected PT result for phentermine. The result was outside of the PT provider's acceptance criteria. The laboratory conducted a root cause analysis and found that phentermine peak in the calibrators and controls had poor integration due to methamphetamine interference. Upon reanalysis, the integration was improved due to better separation from phentermine and methamphetamine. The lab will be modifying and updating their method to use to test for phentermine in the future. And the second is an update of the missed pipette calibration discussed in September, and an appropriate vendor was secured and will be performing on-site calibrations in early December, so that may have happened by this date. Questions for the laboratory? All right, that concludes my believe, are laboratory updates.
Shelley,
Yes. You want a question? Oh, I missed.
No.
Oh.
Just a new business.
A new business thought?
Yeah.
Okay.
So there was a conference held in Albany regarding the commissions, various state commissions. And it was brought to my attention, there was some data presented about OSAC and New York State labs that are participating or planning on implementing. I thought it might be an interesting, it might be good information for the commission to know either officially, unofficially, what labs are looking at OSAC standards for implementation, for unofficial use, planning on doing it. It doesn't necessarily have to be, ascribed to a certain lab. I mean, anonymous would be fine. But just seeing the interest, where people are at.
Yes. So if I can, OSAC documents, there are a lot of them. Those have been a topic of discussion with NICLAC and even more further, the technical working groups for a long time. And I think all of the disciplines that are practiced here in New York, those staff recognize that these documents exist and at various levels have begun reviewing them, discussing them, making each other aware when there's a new one out or when it's open for discussion. So this isn't a topic, this isn't a new topic, I should say. I think at NICLAC meetings, we could certainly discuss it amongst the directors where labs are at. And I think it's fair to say that labs are kind of all over the board as far as implementation, the ability to implement, because some of them are pretty specific with instrumentation.
Yes, I do understand that.
Can I ask if that means you're going to provide a report?
Right, that's what I was gonna ask.
We're getting
Yeah.
there, we're getting there. I don't, how about I can provide an update as to the, where the general consensus is on that. I think, again, I don't think there's any lab that is saying, yep, we're all on board with all of
Right,
the
I
disciplines.
understand why that.
So
would be,
it's very complex.
Yep.
So certainly we can discuss it and I can provide an update, not necessarily a report at this point because it's
At the March
it's
meeting,
ever changing.
Yep.
Right.
if you need support for like survey or something, OFS could help provide support for that. So an update.
Yep. And quite honestly, the update may involve going to the twig level also, right? Because there are so many disciplines amongst most of us.
Yeah, no, I get
that it's
and they're very different.
they are.
But this is just I guess seeing testing the water a little bit with where everyone's at because it was presented at this meeting. I figured the commission should have that information maybe more formalized, just so we know what labs are thinking. That's all.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I can
That'd
verbally
be great.
update you.
Fantastic.
No 10-page report. No.
Communicate.
With bullets,
With bullets. Yeah.
Useful thing, that was me.
So I think this is for Beverly. You had mentioned before in the discussion about the State Department of Health's protocols regarding low copy DNA not being consistent with the public lab protocols. And I'm curious if there's other areas where there's a difference that we could learn from. Maybe this whole thing could actually lead us to something better in the future if we could. Is that something that we can do? Is that too big of a task to examine the differences between the DOH protocols and where it differs from the public lab protocols?
I'm not really fully aware of what the public lab protocols are, so I'd have to have somebody work with me on that. But I can certainly tell you what the requirements are from our side. We have our standards related to forensic identity labs that are privately operated are posted on our website, so they're publicly accessible. But I can give you that information as to where it is.
Remember, the DOH only regulates forensic DNA labs.
Yes.
We have no standards for all of the other disciplines.
Well, we do cover forensic toxicology.
Forensic.
Right. And their procedures and their standard operating procedures, though, might be more universal. I don't know. I don't know who the person would be to do this, but it would seem that if the point was made before that there was a surprise that the public labs protocols were different than the state DOH on low copy DNA, that it might be fruitful to see if there's any other areas where there's a difference and if those should be changed to be either in line with the DOH or the DOH in line with the public labs.
Maybe do a OFS could take a look and see if we can find them if they're publicly available.
I can
Just an
send you the
idea.
website.
Okay.
We could also remember that 30 years ago, there was a proposal that there could have been one accrediting system, not two, but that's just my history. I've been here too long.
Indicated at the beginning. Okay.
All right. Thank you all for your participation today. I'm sorry it's so cold in here. The next meeting, it was not cold here. Upstairs. The next meeting of the Commission on Forensic Science will be on March 14th, 2025. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? You can stay here.
In the
Any
cold.
abstentions? Please have a wonderful and safe holiday.
I didn't make the motion for heat.
Holiday.
Why don't I?